event. And we are live, I believe. Let's just refresh and double check. Okay. Yep. Okay. Yay. Hi. Welcome. How's everyone doing?
Very good.
Awesome. Great. Welcome to our emergency read on Kashmir. We're really excited to have you for our Because We've Read unit for October and November. Right now marks the 83rd day, I believe, of an accelerated Indian occupation, with Article 370 being revoked. This article defines and formalizes India's relationship with Kashmir. An additional or a total of 1 million Indian troops are on the ground and more on Kashmir right now, making the already most militarized region in the world even more militarized. There's also a complete communication blackout, which has apparently changed a little bit recently, which I'd love to talk more about. And tomorrow, actually, October 27th, marks the 72nd year of Indian occupation in Kashmir. And so because of all of this, because of the lack of media coverage, calls for international solidarity, or Because We've Read emergency read unit is reading Until My Freedom Has Come, the new Intifada in Kashmir, edited by the brilliant Sanjay Kak, who's joining us today, published by our, our wonderful friends at Haymarket Books, who have also provided free e-copies for everybody who wants to read, as well as discounted hard copies for those who like to write notes in their books like me. And Haymarket is fabulous, so thank you as always for supporting this work. And yeah, welcome everybody to our live session. Please feel free to drop your comments, your thoughts, questions, and if it's relevant to the current conversation that we're having, I can bring it up and read it off and we can discuss it. But if it's not particularly relevant at that time, we can save it for the end. So feel free to continuously leave your thoughts and comments as we go. And I am so excited and honored and grateful for these three brilliant minds to be joining us on this YouTube live session. First up, we have Sanjay Kak, editor of Until My Freedom Has Come, a filmmaker, a writer, brilliant all-around person, has a very interesting home. I don't think that's your home. It looks very interesting in the background. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have Hafsa Kanjwal, who's an assistant professor of South Asian history at Lafayette College and also runs the infamous, famous Stand With Kashmir, which is a global network of Kashmiri organizers and activists working to push for a free Kashmir. And of course, we have Mohamad Junaid, sporting his new iPhone headphones. We teased him a little bit about before. He's an assistant professor of anthropology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts and specializes in political movements, militarization, space and place, memory studies, and visual anthropology, which are all a bunch of really amazing, exciting things that I hope we also get to talk about today. So thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Hoda.
Great. So obviously the book Until My Freedom Has Come is amazing and wonderful and really important for not only historical context, but really dives into the 2010 uprising in Kashmir. But of course, things are very different now, or they may not be. So would we be able to just get a quick rundown of what exactly the situation looks like on the ground right now today?
So if I can just start, because the book came out in 2011, which is 8 years ago, and it marked not just the uprising of 2010, but actually 2 years that preceded it. So it was actually 3 years of almost continuous upheaval, 2008, 2009, 2010. It was just that 2010 was a cataclysmic year and more than 100 people died. But more than any of that, what was significant and what is really the reason behind putting together that little volume was that after many years of a kind of subdued silence, a lot of young Kashmiris began speaking out. So the Intifada reference was not simply to refer to what was happening on the street, but as much to what people were being able to do from their homes. The internet had arrived, and so suddenly what was very, very noticeable was that young Kashmiris had found their voice, so to speak. If I were to just briefly look through the introduction that the book carries, which was written in late 2010, in some ways it's bizarre because not much has changed in the 9 years since. What has changed is this year and the events that have followed August 5th, and I'll leave it to Junaid and Hafsa to comment on that. But I just want to point out that it is very noticeable that suddenly the Kashmir story is more visible, and thank God for that. But in many ways, the character of the uprising, of the continuous struggle, of the protests, and indeed of the writing about it, is a long. It's a project that has been many years in the making. Yeah.
So I actually, when I think about this book and the current moment, and why it was so significant and why India is afraid of our voice, I like to think of the early 90s when the mass mobilization for independence and freedom began in Kashmir. I am a witness to that moment. I was only 9 years old at that time, but lived through that long period from 1990 to the early 2000s, and then witnessed the events of what Sanjay was referring to, 2008 to 2010, and now the current moment that has kind of been a continuous repression in Kashmir from 2016 onwards, a new scale of repression. In all of these, there have been some voices have been registered, some were not registered. In 1990, when I was growing up, there was so much chaos and repression, violence going on, but there was not an articulation of what this was all about. We knew that it was about freedom. We knew about it was about independence, but there was no concrete way for us young minds to think, make sense of all of this. So when this book came out, it was in a way one of these important moments in itself in the Kashmiri struggle for independence, when our voices were kind of anthologized, to say the least, and so it allowed a lot of people within Kashmir, outside Kashmir, in India, and also around the world, to be able to hear us for the first time. And that's why what has happened recently, the reading down or abrogation of Article 370 and 35A, and the way India has done it is by silencing us, because they're afraid of us as a people, but they're also afraid of us speaking. That's why they took down the internet, they took our cell phones away in Kashmir, and that communication blockade has been an ongoing thing for the last 3 months now. They allow some certain people or some numbers to have the voice, but not others. So just a brief thing about what happened on August 5th, 2019, the Indian government abrogated these 2 historical articles. They were part of this contested history through which Kashmir came to be ruled by India in 1947. 1947 marked both the culmination of the long-standing freedom struggle in Kashmir, which had started in 1931 for equality, democracy, freedom, and also the beginning of colonization and annexation by these post-colonial states that had emerged in the aftermath of British leaving the subcontinent. So Article 370 and 35A reflected that contested history. It became, although over the years, Indian government had used different what are called presidential orders to kind of empty out the content of 370, but it was kind of like a hook for our identity, hook to the past. We kind of looked at it and thought that it was merely a stepping stone towards our eventual emancipation and freedom. And that's what India has taken away. And most consequentially, 35A which gave Kashmiri representatives, however contested way in which they were elected, to decide who will be the permanent resident of Kashmir, who can buy land. So revoking 35A especially puts Kashmir's fragile demography as well as its ecology under tremendous threat from both Indian right wing, which has been calling for like demographic change in Kashmir, which just, in some of its invocations even uses words like, removing Kashmiri Muslims altogether, genocidal in intent, and the threat from Indian corporates who want to take over this fragile landscape and extract profit and monetize our land.
To add to that, what I want to also mention is that the generation that we are talking about here, the one that kind of came to political consciousness in 2008 and beyond, they lived under the militancy. So they lived under this time period where over 700,000 troops, Indian troops were in Kashmir. In the past, between 1947 to the late 1980s, there were also Indian Army was also there, but largely they were away from civilian areas and they were mostly in the border regions between India and Pakistan. But because of the militarization that happened in the 90s, the human rights violations, I mean, everyone probably knows these numbers by now, over 70,000 people killed, 10,000 people disappeared, thousands of women who were raped. That was the moment in which they lived, and that's what they knew. And what's interesting is that in the way that the occupation has always been talked about has always just been Indian voices or Pakistani voices. And I think what this moment 2008 and after did is Kashmiris literally having to force themselves into the narrative because nobody else was listening to them before that. And it didn't happen at the political table. It didn't happen in talks in the UN or in Geneva or else. It happened through things like these books, these anthologies, websites that young Kashmiris would set up where they would talk about their own stories. We really saw at that time a rise in the number of writers, journalists, artists, cartoonists, because Kashmiris realized, and that generation really realized the importance of their own voice in shaping or shifting that narrative. So that has really only continued, and I think it's so critical. There's ways in which our South Asian cultures and societies undermine this kind of work in the humanities and in arts. But I think it's been very instrumental to how this narrative of Kashmir has shifted.
And I'm so grateful for that because mashallah, damn, these Kashmirs are so well written. This book was like so beautiful to read. Everything that all three of you have published or created is just so powerful. And one note also on Article 370, we have a question from Pankhuri Zahir. Is there any merit in asking for restoration of Article 370, or should one only strengthen the demand for a free Kashmir?
That's a good question. I can maybe address that. I mean, with Stand With Kashmir, we don't ask for the restoration of Article 370 because to us, in many ways, Article 370 itself had been our only link really legally to India. And what kind of restoring it would do would put us in an ambiguous pre-August 5th phase, which also wasn't great for Kashmir at all either. It's, some people might just kind of think that, oh, things really only got bad in Kashmir under Modi or after Article 370 was revoked. That's not the case at all. Kashmiris don't really hold any kind of allegiance to Article 370. What they did at the very least hold on to was this idea that Junaid was talking about, that they had control over their land and to be able to buy and sell property. But it's very clear what Kashmiris have been asking for, and it's about time that people start to take note and really address the root cause of the issue.
Yeah, and you also mentioned about the sort of, and Hafsa now, the relationship between land and this article and the revoking of this. And also, right as this is revoked, also so much music coming out of India, sort of pushing for people to come and literally colonize Kashmir and like marry Kashmiri women. The sort of demographic change that India is trying to push for Kashmir seems very prevalent and really centered. And also obviously echoes so much about Israel. Like Israel is always talking about this demographic change from a Muslim majority region. And I also want to know, like, what else, like, what are India's other reasons for occupation? Like, who is actually profiting from? Like, I think I'm very interested in like where the money is going. What are the other sort of stakes at hand? So where's the money behind all of this? Who's actually profiting from an accelerated Indian occupation, and who has sort of I don't know if that's the saying that people say, but
Can I jump in here for a bit?
Yeah. Okay.
So, and I think Junaid will do a better job of this, but for a long time, when we use the word colonizing and colonialism, this question would often be raised that how can you have, what is being extracted, apart from a certain symbolic value that Kashmir offers to India and to Pakistan, it must be said. But I think you've done very well to ask, where's the money in it? Like who profits? And I think apart from its incredibly strategic geographic location, the fight is also about Kashmir's water resources. That the 5 rivers that have created the fertile plains of the Punjab in Pakistan all touch in one way or the other, are either go through or are originated from Kashmir. And India has a very, very strong desire to A, control those rivers, and B, to extract from them what it already is extracting, which is power. So in that sense, it is pretty much a classical colonialism. And it's really only in the last 10 years that, once again, it's been Kashmiris who have pointed out that it's as much a fight about their water as it is about anything else. And maybe Junaid can add to that.
And I of course agree with Sanjay with what is being extracted now, but we also need to understand that capitalism, the way it works is speculating into the future. What can be extracted ahead. And that's what the Indian capitalism is about. If you look at Kashmir, the Indian occupation has meant that a specific set of corporates in India, industrialists in India, have eyed Kashmir as a potential site of their investments in future. And look, South Asia, we know that is facing a water crisis in general with climate change and global warming and all of that. Cities like Chennai don't have water. And the Kashmiri rivers, they may be diverted, the water will be taken away from people and given to people in India. Also, there's a forest cover that is already under tremendous threat in Kashmir. I was just reading reports about how the Forest Advisory Board cleared 125 new projects in its last days. What are those projects about? What kind of who will have access to that forest land? This is land that's already under state control. This is not in the hands of private Indian Kashmiris. The Indian government can now decide, with not only the removal of 35A, but also turning Kashmir into a union territory, how this land is going to be utilized. So the way nature has been exploited in South Asia, it is going to be in future extracted from Kashmir, that value. So that's one. The second, is the political capital. And that's how nationalism works. In India, one can, there's not a seemingly direct relationship between why India needs to control Kashmir if the Kashmiris do not want to be controlled by India. But Kashmir has been turned into sort of this empty signifier within the Indian national politics, which can be invoked as some kind of like a ghost each time the political parties in India have to go to the polls. So repression in Kashmir, continued militarization of Kashmir becomes a way for Indian politicians to show, see how tough we are on these anti-nationals. So vote for us if you want to continuously oppress us to continuously oppress them. So giving poor Indians, many of them are poor, a hope that, and even middle class Indians, that we will take away this land that Kashmiris are squatting on. But of course, the land is not going to go to the poor Indians. It's going to go to the capitalists, the big moneyed people.
Yeah, and I just want to say I love that you guys have been answering everyone's questions that have been coming up naturally, which has been great and helpful. And also I think that something that is, and I definitely want to come back to class, especially when it's related to India and Kashmir. But I think something else that's really fascinating for me about Kashmir is how it's such a model for so many other things that are happening around the world. Like you can talk about Kashmir and learn about Israel or vice versa, and just coming back from Palestine just a few months ago, even some of the words almost verbatim, the things that I've heard Palestinian activists and resistance organizers saying, coming from Kashmiris on the ground, even similar strategies, but also even like the militarism of all of it. So it's US tested weapons and in Afghanistan now being sold to India. So the sort of global arms trade and global arms testing of weapons, with also Kashmir being at the end of that. Even like the internal dynamics of Kashmiris, on page 7, there was a quote that said that many first-time voters tasted their first betrayal after this person had a lot of ideas and hope for the country turned out to sort of just dilute everything again. And that also reminds me of a lot of Black organizers in the United States who also had hope in Obama, and then sort of seeing that sort of process and losing hope again in the electoral system. And that's something that we also talked a little bit with Article 370, this environmental damage that we're talking about. So what sort of global relationships do you see are so important for us to be understanding between maybe countries that we're in, because people right now are listening from around the world, that may not be instantly clear, that you think are important to be highlighting, that is sort of on a global relation of power, militarism, or ideology?
I just wanted to just say one thing before hopefully Hafsa or Junaid will answer your question, which is that, the collaboration is not simply from those who are at the receiving end of it. I mean, you are seeing parallels in the language and the tactics of those who struggle. But in fact, it's equally important to see that there is not just implicit or tacit collusion, but there is real collaboration. So for example, over the last decade and a half, the kind of coziness between the state of Israel and India has been something which is remarkable in India's own history, and given its positions on Palestine historically. And this time around in Kashmir, after August 5th, after the clampdown, both in terms of the technological infrastructure which was put into place, as well as simply the way in which, say, the city of Srinagar, the largest city in the Kashmir Valley, was sought to be controlled. Those methods were not, it was not just a casual coincidence, with what is, what you see in the Gaza Strip. This was literally by the same book, those strategies were played by that book. So the collusion between, let's say in this particular case, between the defense and securitization of, which is played out by the Israeli state, is has a direct connection with what we see in India and certainly in Kashmir. Yeah.
Yeah, to add to that, I think the statistic is that India is the largest buyer of Israeli arms in the world, which is really significant. So that relationship is very cemented in a, you know, in terms of this corporate economy. Also, India and Israel share strategies. Their Indian police forces, they've even sent Jammu and Kashmir police forces to go to Israel and get trained there.
Just like across the United States as well, yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So there is kind of this nexus with Israel, the United States, India, in terms of this kind of militarism and shared surveillance and all of these things. And of course, we know that they also make use of the global war on terror in terms of their ideological links to just paint whether it's Palestinians or Kashmiris as terrorists, right? So they share those kinds of strategies as well.
Adding to that, you know, it's interesting that US, Israel, and India are invoked in the same breath now, because US calls itself the largest oldest democracy, and India calls itself the largest democracy, and Israel calls itself the only democracy in the region. And the roots of US democracy lie in settler colonial state, you know, from which it emerges. And Israel, of course, has been carrying out this settler colonial project in Palestinian lands for last 73 years now. And India is on the same path. That's why when Kashmiris look at Palestine, when we try to understand American history itself, we are scared that this is the logical, you know, connection that they are trying to make. That, see, if you want to be the largest and the oldest democracy, you have to curb some people's rights. These spaces that are, you know, in the margins of our states, they need to be controlled with exceptional brutality. And we need to take over the land to make democracy possible. So, I mean, these connections aren't superficial, they are real. And of course, as Sanjay and Hafsa pointed out, they share strategies, they share material resources, and they share a history. That's what I want to say.
Thank you for that. That was really powerfully put. And I think that something else that I also want to sort of, we touched upon a little bit at the beginning, was sort of the young people now. So not, I don't want to use the word democracy now, the democratization of resistance. But, and so in the book, it was sort of mentioning about how there was sort of one central figure, Masrat Al-Ambat, who was sort of putting up protest calendars, even though underground, he was sort of leading a lot of movements, but at the same time, the sort of new younger generation of Kashmiris with no police record were sort of taking to the streets and on social media, as you've all mentioned, and really sort of changing up the game. So I'm wondering today, who is on the streets right now? What does the composition of the resistance movement look like?
I'll say something about the book and the time since it was put together, because I think that the book was also written in a lot of hope, in that I think certainly all of us felt that this was a very important moment, that you see, because sometimes speaking up is not simply a question of putting the truth out there. It's also a question of discovering the truth for yourself. So as Junaid pointed out, like when he was a 9-year-old in 1990, they knew there was a struggle for something, for freedom, but what are the contours of that? What is its history? What is, you know, what are its connections? What is its worldview? These were not things on which there was a lot of clarity. So I think that the intifada of the mind that we talked about in 2008, 2009, 2010, it was not simply in communicating the facts of what was going on in Kashmir to the rest of the world. It was also Kashmiris speaking to each other, you know, and speaking to themselves very often and saying, so what is going on? You know, I mean, Junaid has an epilogue in the book where he talks about a, you know, like a possible manifesto of what could our vision of Kashmir be. And maybe everybody doesn't have to agree with that. But I think it's very important to recognize that when you write, when you paint, when you make films, it's not simply, you're not simply reporting the situation, you're also discovering it for yourself, and I think that was very important. But having pointed out to that moment of great excitement that all of us felt in 2010, 2011, I have to say that I don't feel so optimistic right now. The shutdown of the internet for close to 3 months, the extreme militarization of the street, the inability of people to speak up in any sort of way, the very, very high cost of speaking up means that there is a kind of ominous silence that is building up. And that is very, very frightening, because when you see 50,000 people on the street, it's a protest, but it's also an expression of joy, But when the same 50,000, 100,000, 10, a million people are locked inside their homes for close to 3 months, then that's a pressure cooker, that's a hand grenade, and that would really worry me.
I just had something quick to add to Sanjay's point about, we're witnessing so many protests around the world right now, right? We saw the Sudanese protests, we saw protests in Hong Kong, now we're seeing these protests in Lebanon, millions, literally millions of people on the streets. And I'm so inspired by them, but then it also breaks my heart because Kashmiris are not even allowed to protest. Like on a very fundamental level, they are not allowed to gather and protest. The images that we see are kind of in particular neighborhoods that have, some leeway or, people have managed to keep the army at bay. Those are some of the images that have been coming out in the past couple of months. But I think back to these moments in 2008 and 2010, when there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street in Kashmir, and India realized that the optics of that obviously look bad for the kind of narrative that they're trying to push to the international community about all of these people. There's a small segment, and they still do this, the way that they're talking about the reaction to these recent events is that, oh, it's just a small segment of people who are unhappy. They're, sponsored by Pakistan. Everyone else is fine. We're just going to take some time. India doesn't even allow that kind of expression to take root on the streets. So who do we usually end up seeing is these young men mostly who are really driven to some kind of desperation. It's mostly the lower classes, it becomes very fractured in terms of class in that sense as well. But that is the amount of repression. I mean, the world's largest democracy is not allowing protests to even take place.
I also want to add to the three different moments that I have mentioned about the Kashmiris rising up, calling for independence. They also happened at times when there was a global upsurge of demand for rights. Like 1990 happened at the time when the Cold War was coming to an end. 2010 in Kashmir kind of precedes what was called the Arab Spring. And what is happening now, as Hafsa pointed out, is happening in the context of this larger populist nationalist governments coming into power, which are very repressive and do not care about human rights at all. They don't want to even consider them. And in response to which a lot of new protests are taking place. For Kashmir, for Kurds, for Palestinians, for all other, for these people, their struggles are slightly at a tangent with what is happening within countries. The Arab Spring, the Lebanese protests, and the protests in Sudan, they are demanding transformation within the existing states. But in Kashmir, that is not possible. That those possibilities have been denied. And you earlier mentioned, Badu, if I remember correctly, about what are these events and how do we recognize possibilities, plurality of possibilities within these events, is to also recognize the difference. That these are not same struggles. At the end, because there can be a pro-democracy, anti-fascist movement in India, but which will be all legit and everything. But in Kashmir, that kind of struggle will not be neither possible, not allowed, nor would it kind of have any fidelity to the actual situation in Kashmir. People in Kashmir have been told, you should fight like this, you should have street protests, you should do this and that. It's not always possible. Of course, state does not allow any of these expressions. The only way in which one can imagine a protest taking place is if India really loosens its tight grip on Kashmir. And the obverse of that is that India will never do that. As you know, and that's where probably Sanjay's pessimism, or if I may call it so, comes from as well, because we know from several years of these protests now that India does not want to loosen its grip, and and we are also thinking about possibilities of where to connect our struggles with global struggles, where to learn from, where India will be forced to loosen that grip, because it's not going to give up to pro-democracy protests. That's why these struggles, there's no need now to talk about, return of 370, because it was like a flimsy thing. What we really need to demand is the thing that Kashmiris need, not what they aspire for simply, but what they need. And that is total freedom from this occupational structure and state.
Oh. That was a lot. Thank you for setting a very depressing but real tone. And I think that really puts a lot of things in perspective as well, but also just makes the situation even more urgent, because if India, God forbid, is successful in what it wants to do, then this is definitely like we would have to be kidding ourselves if we don't think that Israel, the United States, Hong Kong, all of these areas right now are looking also to India to see what are the results of this. If we actually move toward this sort of complete blackdown, complete shutdown, will we be able to get what we need faster without international outcry? And so far, they've kind of seen it. And I think that we're seeing also as a rise of like fascist and authoritarian states across the world, this is not only a reality for Kashmir, but also a sort of foreboding future for a lot of the countries that we live in across the world as well. If we are not there right now, being able to change the future and fate for all of our countries, honestly. And I think that there's a lot of questions also right now that are sort of related to what can be done, which I definitely want to get into. Also sort of related questions about Muslim versus Hindu issues. And one person mentions that I wouldn't argue that the grip India holds on Kashmir delegitimizes the intersectionality of the Kashmiri struggle with that of Palestine, indigenous struggles in the United States, etc. What you just said would only highlight that legitimacy, which I think is what you're trying to say as well. But one thing that I also want to come back to really quickly is that I've also noticed is really parallel in a lot of situations globally, is this idea of class. So throughout the book, it's mentioned that the government is offering its payroll as a solution to the problem of political disenchantment. The middle and upper class have, quote, tinted SUVs revved and ready to go. But also on the Indian side, there's so much layers of empire and masculinity and class, in that just like in the United States, the majority of the army is not like Indian nationalists, but they're poor people. They're from low economic class and social caste. And it's not this sort of like political or nationalist zeal, but it's more that it's a product of their poverty, and it's a product of also Indians being under British occupation, that has created different situations that now they must, quote unquote, I don't believe that it's a requirement, but that there's no other option, but join the army. And so there's a lot of sort of layers and complications when we talk about class and we bring class into this picture. And so I was wondering if you'd be able to sort of break that down a little bit, and sort of rifle through this complexity of class, both on the Kashmiri and Indian side.
Sanjay? Okay, well, I'll try to see. Yes, there is complexity, but I think we also are at a moment when we really need to bring down this complexity to some understandable, coherent level. One of the ways in which the occupation continues to control us, controls our imagination as well, and rules our hopes, is by trying to say that there's too much complexity, nothing can be done. See, all these resonances that you're bringing up, all these connections that you're bringing up, suggest that we are living at a moment when things are beginning to clarify. There is a global elite, there's of which Indian capitalists, Indian political elite are part of, who have defined their own interest, that their interest is in ruling or taking the majority of the share of the world through hook or crook, using repression, violence, and whatever. And on the other side is the majority of the world, peoples who are living in their own situations, but are confronted with these repressive regimes. So we have to recognize, first of all, that cleave has opened up between these two large formations. Second, yes, you can go back to Gramsci and talk about how certain groups of people kind of misrecognize their own interests. In my essay for this book, it also happened. I was writing this essay at the end of a four-month-long repression in Kashmir, looking at CRPF soldiers who would throw stones at our own house, break vehicles, and beat up kids on the streets. And I would look at their eyes and their bodies and think, in their own context back in India, they're considered poor, they're considered lower castes. They will not be touched, they should not be seen, and their interests are not taken care of. What makes them come to Kashmir and perform on the behalf of the oppressor? And it has to do with, of course, the misrecognition of interest, but it also has to do with the new psychology that repression engenders among people, within the majority, especially the poorer people among the majority. I mean, much of the anti-Muslim violence, for instance, that is taking place across India or took place under Modi's rule in Gujarat was also done by lower and middling castes and classes. So I think that there is a class dimension to it, but we have to recognize that it is not purely about interests of these people. It is about psychology of domination. Like an Indian soldier back home would be repressed, but when he arrives in Kashmir, he sees himself as kind of like the ruler of the place. So he determines how we walk, who speaks, who's allowed to stand outside. So there's that element. I'll let Sanjay pick up from there.
I'm going to take this in a different direction, which is that classically, and this is one of the charges that the people, the Indian state will levy towards the movement in Kashmir, which is to say, oh, the leadership here is a political elite, their own children study abroad, and they'll just let the poor come out onto the street and, get themselves killed. Now, firstly, this is not right, because even in the 90s, there were many upper middle class people, including professionals, who were involved in the movement. And many of them paid a very heavy price for that. They were completely, rubbed out. Certainly, there was a middle period in which the middle class, wherever it is in the world, has a strong sense of self-preservation. And so it kind of retreated, even in Kashmir, into this business of self-preservation. But I would say that if something that, again, if we are going to that watershed moment of 2008, 2009, 2010, slowly you see more and more middle-class people, irrespective of their self-interest, actually putting themselves on the line. And I would say that the recent events of August 5th actually have whatever little space there was for a kind of pro-India or soft on India sentiment, I find people who in the past were, let's put it bluntly, unsympathetic to the struggle, to what is known as a tehreek. Today, their language is very, very different. So I think that in a psychological sense, the writing down or the reading down of Article 370 and 35A, what it has done, and it might be a temporary phase, I'm not sort of, I wouldn't bank on it, has actually gotten rid of the class difference in terms of where people want to see themselves. And that even the Kashmiri elite, wherever they are in the world, whether in the United States or in the UK, and there is a Kashmiri elite of professionals, of doctors, of engineers, of scientists, and architects, and so on, that even they have decided that no, now you can't straddle the line. You have to step back, you have to take a position, you have to go out and protest, you have to speak up, So I think that way, I think we are seeing in this last decade, we are seeing once again the class divide becoming less significant within Kashmir, and that's the point I want to make.
To add to that, the point about the Kashmiri elites, I mean, I'm in the diaspora, I grew up in the diaspora, and for the past few decades, even as we knew the kinds of things that were happening in Kashmir, it was very difficult for people to get the diaspora to really care and take action. There was either a sense of, nothing's going to change, like this force that this notion of Kashmir being intractable is really powerful. It's the use of the term intractability is used in policy circles, it's used in the media, it's used even amongst Kashmiris. And what that ends up doing is it kind of creates this level of complacency where people just don't feel that anything can be done. And I think that's what this one thing has really shifted, is to kind of push us out of that mentality that nothing can be done. It can't be done because you're not actually doing anything about it. So I've really seen this significant shift in the diaspora, even people who before were, talking about, well, if India just didn't do these human rights violations, maybe we'd be better off. It's, it's not a big deal. But what people didn't fundamentally understand is that India is doing these human rights violations because people are asking for freedom. And if it's not going to stop doing them until people stop that, so there's this line, I think, that was floating around in Twitter the other day, that Kashmiris are not asking for azadi because they're being detained, tortured, and etc. Because they're asking for azadi is why this is happening. So again, to kind of get us to the root of what the issue is.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that also sort of ties to the next thing that I want to talk about, that also shifts, if any, in the role of violence, and sort of the line that you said is that it's sort of the switching of the playing field between like who is actually seen as doing the violence. In the book, it sort of mentions that one of the decisions that Kashmiris made from a violent resistance movement to a non-violent one was sort of to pose a moral challenge to the Indian army, to not allow them to justify violence to be happening toward Kashmiris, but how much more violent can the most militarized region of the world be? So I think, and it's also something that's really interesting too, because Palestinians at the similar time actually also decided to make a shift between a violent resistance movement and intifada, between one that is now a non-violent, largely movement. So what do you feel like, especially now, given the sort of this level of hopelessness that exists on this conversation, and has the role of violence shifted for Kashmiris? And if so, why or how?
I have a serious problem with the use of violence to describe what we are talking about here. Violence is, equally what the state performs in Kashmir or elsewhere, whether it's the Indian state or the US government. That's also violence. So what we're talking about here is armed struggle. Let's put it that way, and I think that the decision to take to arms or to bear arms, I doubt if it's always a moral or an ethical impulse. It's often tactical. I remember having a conversation with somebody who one time was an important figure in the armed resistance. And he was an old man when I had this conversation with him many years ago. And he said to me that we pulled back on the armed struggle because we were losing too many young men. And we did not want a Kashmir which had no young people. It was too much of a price to pay. So in that sense, it's tactical. It comes from an understanding that you're up against one of the most powerful armies of the world. You're up against an army that is not going to be guided by by some Gandhian principles, which is going to be brutalize you. So it simply doesn't make sense to address that opponent with rocks and stones, or the odd weapon that you might have access to. So I don't think, and this is, I would generalize this beyond Kashmir, that when people take to arms or when they give up arms, when they decide to, these are tactical political questions. And that's how we should see them. And certainly, I don't think we should use a blanket term like violence to describe it, because poverty is violence. Everyday life in large parts of India is violence. To live in a slum in Bombay or in a slum in Delhi is violence. But an armed resistance is a different thing.
And also, I would say that there is violence in the sense that Indian presence in Kashmir constitutes violence. The presence of almost 1 million Indian soldiers armed to the teeth, roaming around streets, controlling people is violence. It's a violation of our humanity. It's a violation of Kashmiri fundamental basic rights. And the armed resistance or any other form of resistance that Kashmiris tactically use, as Sanjay pointed out, is actually for emancipation from that violence. From that state violence. See, I think that when it comes to the question of armed struggle or different tactics that Kashmiris have used over the years, they have been necessitated by the specific form that state violence takes. At some points, the state violence becomes, has to be pushed back. It has to be told that, there will be response from Kashmiris as well. There's one of the important events recently that took place was in February 2019, when this young Kashmiri boy blew himself up, and there was this, and it became an international news. A lot of people forgot that the people who died in them, and I don't condone killing of individual soldiers or anyone, but these are the soldiers, these are the forces that have been continuously oppressing Kashmiris. They go into the villages, burn their livestock, mix rice with rocks, beat up young kids, shoot them, launch tear gas into the houses, use pellet guns to blind people. So there was like this prehistory to this event. But when, the way Indian government narrates this is as if like it came out of nothing. And that's why it justified India's going into launching what they call the surgical strikes into Pakistan. So what I'm trying to say here is reinforcing what Sanjay is saying, that these are tactical decisions that happen within specific contexts, and they have a history.
Oh, definitely. And I apologize if my question came off the wrong way. I just found out I had a Wikipedia page and they called me a pacifist, and I am not a pacifist. So I think my question is not, sort of why is Kashmir deciding violence or not, but I think the role of strategic armed resistance that has been sort of quelled up until this point, have things changed with this sort of intensive now communications blackout, all sorts of and the intensive militarism that happens right now. So I think is the current situation calling for a shift in the sort of strategic use of violence or non-violence by Kashmiris on the ground?
Okay, so let me just like expand on what I was saying. There has been much speculation about what the Kashmiri response will be, as if that response isn't already taking place. Some people have been saying that there's like a volcano that's ready to erupt, as if Kashmiris constitute some kind of like you know, undifferentiated mass, which is always reactive, which is always ready to explode. No, that's not what is going to happen. People are not just going to take up arms. If, yes, there was a possibility where people could throw Indian state out of Kashmir using armed means, they would definitely do that, because Kashmiris would take any methods that would liberate them from the occupation. There is a response right now. This is in the form of what people have called civil disobedience. People are telling, despite the communication blockade, despite the fact that Indian government does not want the world to see what Kashmiris are saying or hear them, Kashmiris are visually representing, by keeping away from their ordinary life activities, telling the world, not just to Indians, telling the world that we resent the Indian state's presence here. We resent what they are doing to us in this incremental genocidal way. So the response, what is happening on streets, from what we hear in these broken ways, that the news that reaches us, is that people, of course, are upset, angry, and they've always been angry with the occupation. There's not been a single moment in the modern history of Kashmir where people have not been angry with India and its presence in Kashmir. And if India hopes that this moment will pass and Kashmir will return to some kind of like a normal, so that the settler occupation project can continue, that's not definitely going to happen.
Definitely. And you also mentioned anger, which I think ties to a few questions that we have right now about hopelessness as well. And Hani Lufti asked that there's hopelessness in so many, there's also in that hopelessness, there is strength and just the anger to be able to do more. And so I think, how are Kashmiris right now able to sort of practice hope and find hope and be able to keep moving forward despite the sort of current situation on the ground?
So I'll take a crack at this. I think that, a political struggle that is continuously optimistic is also fooling itself. I think it's very important periodically for any struggle to stop and pause and say, is it time to recalibrate? Do we shift tactics? Because otherwise you can go on and on for decades without. So I think that after August 5th, we have no means of sort of generalizing across the population. But there is no doubt in my mind that people have used this silence in order to rethink some things. We also know that post August 5th and preceding it, literally the entire political leadership of Kashmir, of whatever persuasion, including the pro-India leadership, have been arrested, and they are currently incarcerated. So in the absence of your the interlocutors, your political interlocutors, that who you're used to negotiating with everyday politics, in their absence, and the fact that they are all behind bars, I think that Kashmiris are thinking, and the one thing I can say with some certainty, from a brief visit that I made during this period and from regularly being in touch with friends, is that it has only strengthened people's resolve. The fact that you are stopping to think, you're not simply coming out on the street and throwing yourself before a very, very brutal military apparatus, does not mean that you have given up. And I think that I would argue actually that it's actually been tactically quite a brilliant thing, because they have actually extended the sort of the effort of the military apparatus without, with very, very minimal costs so far in terms of, life, minimal. I'm not saying there's no loss of life. So I just think that, we have to be attentive to the fact that, it's a quiet time, it's an introspective time, it's a time of shock, but I don't believe that it's hopeless. That's not how I would read it, and maybe Hafsa and Junaid might disagree or agree.
I guess one thing, I mean, because of the communication clampdown, the fact that there's no internet, people on the ground actually don't even know all of this stuff that's been happening internationally. We were able to get through a landline to some family members, and we asked them, did you know that the US Congress had a hearing on Kashmir, this past Tuesday? People didn't know. Their media is clearly not telling, the Indian media is clearly not saying any of this, and we don't know exactly what they have access to. I think in that moment of feeling alone, and this is what Kashmiris have felt for a really long time, is that perhaps with the exception of Pakistan, no other country, no other entity, no other international institution has leveraged their cause in any way, shape, or form. But now there have been, I mean, there's significant mobilizations that are happening around the world, which are completely unprecedented in this 70 plus years of occupation. And I wish that people on the ground could see that, because it would give them hope. And it would kind of strengthen their resolve even further. But, right now that remains to be seen.
And also, I think that we need to look at the structure of hope itself, this word. A lot of, some people who are actually on the ground, who are resisting, they're not going into the struggle with the hope of like an easy victory or something, they know fully well, having seen how the state operates, that it's a gradual process, like movement from one thing to another. Because first of all, there is no giving up. Giving up means end of your existence. That's what the state wants. So resistance is imperative. It's like the only way you can exist. And the second, they know that it's an incremental process. And third, they also know that the present moment creates this illusion that the present is going to always continue in the future. And they think Azadi, the freedom, is not a utopia. Utopia is the domination of India, that Indian domination is a utopia, because this is what Indian government tells us, keeps telling us, that we will always control you and we will defeat you. And if we fall for that, if we fall for this false rhetoric, then that's our defeat. But Kashmiris are not going to fall for that. The second source of hope is these resonant struggles around the world. The Palestinians, the Sudanese, the Lebanese, Kurds, all of these struggles that are going on around the world show that the fractures between the dominant and the dominated are becoming wider and wider. You can see that pervading through even a society like the US, which is culturally well known to not care about the world. Within even the US, you can sense a pervasive feeling that something needs to be changed. And so there are sources of hope. I feel like on the ground, the resilience of the people who continue to believe that they need to incrementally reach towards a goal, and the global frictions that are opening up make me kind of, in a way, optimistic that there's no end yet.
Definitely. And also, I think that the sort of global response that we're seeing is both, I think, a sort of hope, but also in a way a sort of despair, given a lot still of media, a lack of media coverage, a lack of people speaking out globally as well. And so someone's question here, Brother Naz asks, are countries afraid of nuclear weapons? Are they afraid of deals being cut? What are they afraid of that they don't work and support Kashmiris? So what do you feel like are sort of the large reasons why people are not coming out to support Kashmir on a global scale? either state-based or like on an individual personal level?
So, I mean, if you ask me, they're not afraid of anything. They are in the thrall of the markets, you know. So I think the reason why most Western countries are reluctant to step in, even as they are fully aware of what is going on, is simply because there is still that illusion that India is this endless market for the West, you know, for Western capital, for Western goods, for Western arms. And I think the fact that the Indian economy has begun to tank and has been so slowly grinding down or winding down, global capital is too afraid to recognize that, because you know it's like suddenly recognizing that some place where you had a lot of hope in terms of that's where you thought the next big growth bubble for capitalism is going to, for capital, Western capital is going to come from. It's not coming. So they're hedging their bets. So foreign direct investment has actually come down. But so long as they see some possibility, the lips of other countries are sealed, you know. So I think that's a very, very important factor which keeps people in line, you know. And it has to be said that previous governments too did the same, but this government in particular, for example, I don't know if you picked up on this, but Mahathir of Malaysia, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, he made a statement in you know, a pretty strong statement on Kashmir. And the first thing that happened is that India announced that they were not going to buy any palm oil from Malaysia. You know, I don't know if that's going to make a difference to the Malaysian economy, but this is the kind of carrot and stick that all states deploy, and certainly so does the Indian state. And so if we just look at the United States, for example, I would say that the message is a little more ambiguous, because we've seen in the past that American media attention has also been very fickle. You know, while we all recognize that the big American newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, have been doing a great job this time around. And they have done a great job even earlier in the early 90s. But very often you can suddenly see a tapering off of interest. And that tapering off of interest is not an innocent act. You know, it comes because, you know, there are commercial interests, the State Department weighs in, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's not as if anybody, if there's global silence on Kashmir, I don't think it's because they buy into the Indian argument. But I think the allure of the Indian market is so far being quite a strong factor.
And I want to quickly also say that, you know, when I talk to people here in the US about, is it the Indian market that is making you silent on Kashmir? Often people, ordinary people would be like, what Indian market? You know, we have to understand that there are think tanks and some industries, some corporates, and some state officials who might like to push this argument here in the US. And a lot of this has also created this brouhaha about Indian market by Indian government itself. Like, they use immense amounts of money to talk about how India is incredible and shining and all of that. But in truth, you know, as Sanjay has suggested too, you know, with the tanking of the slow tanking of Indian economy, a lot of that discourse is losing its power, and ordinary people, you know, who actually will soon elect somebody else to power here in the US and in their own governments across the West, they do not necessarily see you know, Indian market as Indian market. They really are worried about you know, what's going on, you know, with Kashmiris, what's going on with other people struggling for their rights.
I'd also say, I mean, in addition to the market, India has in the past had significant soft power with its cultural outputs, things like yoga, Bollywood, all of these things. I did a class, I taught my students yesterday about Kashmir, and when I asked them, you know, what are the words that you usually associate with India and what are the words that you usually associate with Pakistan, they were obviously fundamentally different. And then after I told them about what's been going on in Kashmir, they were just stunned. They were just like, we had no idea that India could be like this, because the narrative about India is very different. I mean, at the most, you'll get kind of this slumdog millionaire kind of story, but you don't hear much about the communalism, because India purports itself, even now under a Hindu nationalist government, as a secular state, you know, that's welcome and open to all of its religious minorities. But just, I mean, the amount of fantasy that the Indian state kind of plays into is just phenomenal to me. I can't get over it, and that the people kind of tend to buy into it. But I think with this media attention and with these mobilizations and education that's happening, we're hoping that a lot of that changes, right? Because I don't necessarily think, as Junaid mentioned, ordinary people care about how great India's market economy is. These are kind of at the top level of policy, but ordinary people know how certain countries and certain regions are talked about. And that shift is really fundamental.
Definitely. So someone named Munis Ali, who says that if anything, our people have found a clarity like none other in the past 70 plus years. Yes, brutality, yes, more oppression, but clarity nonetheless. And our son Aziz asks, what do you think about India's Kashmir experts and how they write and define Kashmir, and what can be done to counter that sort of India's Kashmir experts in India?
So
and we also do have a lot of listeners from India who are listening as well.
So I don't know, when we say India's Kashmir experts, whether we are supposed to count the ones who appear on television, because you know, they certainly don't deserve to be counted. But I think
in air quotes, experts.
Yeah, one of the things that I would draw attention is to the fact that the Kashmiris have reclaimed the conversation around Kashmir quite substantially, you know. And I think that the comfort that the Indian state had in terms of its control over the narrative, they still might be able to do that, let's say, because of its complete control over the mainstream or corporate-owned media in India, because of its, you know, absolutely vice-like grip on the social media. The government in power right now certainly has that. But they have not been able to control the narrative internationally. You know, the net makes it possible, and we've been speaking about that. So I think that one of the great achievements of this last decade that we've been speaking about is that that the kind of the narrative around Kashmir has been wrested back from the Indian state. And that is a fantastic achievement. And quite honestly, I say this as a Kashmiri, that Kashmiris have done it, you know. And even today, I think even today, all this very outstanding reportage that you see coming out of Kashmir and appearing in the international news channels, because the government of India does not allow foreign journalists to enter Kashmir, all that reporting is, for the most part, being done by Kashmiris, you know. So I think that when we spoke about, you know, the participation of an emerging middle class, you know, the participation should not be seen as restricted only to putting your life on the line on the street, you know, in a face-off with the security forces. I think that young people have honed their skills in all kinds of ways, their writing skills, their thinking skills, and actually being able to make a dent in global opinion. I mean, if you look at any of the significant steps in the recent past, you know, you have two outstanding UN reports. Those are based in turn on work which has been done by civil society groups within Kashmir. You know, these are not international groups, or certainly they're not certainly Indian groups. You know, so I'm just saying that there is a multiplicity, multiple ways in which people have been working, which somehow has begun to coalesce in ways in which today, we are having this conversation around Kashmir on this platform, which would not have been possible 15 or 20 years ago.
To maybe add to that, and sorry, Junaid. So what's really interesting though is that the more Kashmiris speak up, and as Kashmiris, the Indian state kind of the broader media establishment and their Kashmir experts will not even give Kashmiris the agency of being Kashmiris. So Stand With Kashmir are the organization, the global grassroots movement, which is led entirely by the Kashmiri diaspora from Indian occupied Kashmir, by a recent Indian expert on Kashmir who represented India at the US Congress recently, was called Pakistan's ISI team. So this is the kind of, they're not even able to accept that Kashmiris would have a say. Again, like I mentioned, for so long, it was just Indians and Pakistanis talking to each other, and Kashmiris have forced themselves into that narrative, into that space. But they're not even willing to give us any kind of sense of our own identity, right? Because once they identify that, yes, these are Kashmiri speaking, then obviously they're kind of acknowledging that something is gravely wrong. So they won't even allow that thing to take place.
I just want to also say that the Indian discourse on Kashmir can broadly be divided into three groups. At one level is these smaller individuals, conscientious individuals who go on to Kashmir, talk to ordinary people, come back and write reports. Very few in number, but brave and courageous. Above them is this large mass of people who are who, because of the transformation in India's corporate media and stuff, have been weaving a net of around themselves, and they've created this entire new reality, a cocoon, if you will, and they think. They debate with each other within that cocoon and believe their own reality that they concoct every night on Indian TV to be true. They have absolutely zero connection with reality. Then there above them are, of course, individuals and people who work with media and government who do it conscientiously. They are like propagandists. They try to spin. They try to conduct polls in Kashmir to basically tell the world that, okay, Kashmiris are with us. Kashmiris support all of this. Now, to understand this, there are close to probably 100 million Indian trolls on internet who try to silence any sane, rational, reasonable voice. There's a political economy of likes and retweets and all of that. One could go into, but they are scared of every single Kashmiri voice. I mean, right now there are only 8 to 10 million Kashmiris, and out of that, only very few people have access to internet. And the Indian government has been telling the world governments that the world should, these countries should, take out these Kashmiri cells, meaning us, and they are telling Twitter to take away, erase any tweet that Kashmiri tweets, any mention of Kashmir on Twitter. There was a, CJP report recently suggesting that 1 million tweets mentioning Kashmir were wiped clean from Twitter. The same with Facebook, where our friends, activists who are talking about Kashmir, they're suddenly told that their accounts do not exist anymore. So the level of repression and control and wiping out of Kashmiri voices, to me, it's our success. I feel that India is terrified of every single Kashmiri voice. Otherwise, no country of a 1.2 billion with a $5 trillion economy would use all instruments of its internal and external power to silence Kashmiri voices.
Yeah, and actually a lot of people in the comments right now have been saying that they've been hearing India call the movement in diaspora as Kashmiri South. So we have a lot of people also sort of citing out things that they've heard India call sort of this diaspora movement. So I'm going to have two more questions that are really interesting, and then we'll close it off. One question that also is sort of related to this idea of this formulation or denial of Kashmiri identity. This question by Hamza Amin says, what do you think should be the role of the Kashmiris in Pakistan who are losing touch with their heritage over time? How can they be better allies without reinforcing Pakistan's claim to Kashmir? Which is a very interesting question.
Junaid, do you want to?
Okay, thanks, Hafsa.
Leave the difficult ones for Junaid.
Yeah. Well, okay. I think the question of Pakistan has always been like ambiguous and strange for Kashmiris, because on one side, Kashmiris recognize the solidarity that ordinary Pakistanis give to Kashmir. There is, at one level, a cultivated ignorance about Kashmir's history, its specificity, its people's, culture and our resistance. On the other hand is the Pakistani state, which whose narrative of Kashmir banega Pakistan, which means like Kashmir will merge with India, with Pakistan, of course, is interested in continuation of that old discourse. They haven't really, in a way, disabused themselves from some of the notions that emerged before Kashmiri voices were recognized in the 90s and onwards. Much of Pakistani discourse remains confined to the logics of the partition which divided the British Indian Empire into India and Pakistan. And Kashmir, they see as somehow the unfinished business of that partition. And Kashmiris are saying that we're not business. We're not some unfinished part. We have our own history, our own identity. And it is important to recognize this. If you want to give us your solidarity, let it be unconditional. Don't demand in return for your solidarity, however heartfelt it may be, that Kashmiris will automatically then become part of Pakistan. Let Kashmiris decide what they want to do with their future. So I think, probably that answers some of this question, but I agree that there's a lot more to be fleshed out.
And Hoda, I think if the question that was being asked was about how people on the Kashmiris on the Pakistan side of the line of control are feeling, well, it has to be said that, obviously the Pakistani state is probably as neurotic about their responses to what's happening here, So I think that Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control are hostage, but not in the same way, obviously. It would, one is not making that claim that, both are suffering equally. But certainly, I think that for people on the Pakistan side of the border to speak up about Kashmir, it will happen within certain controlled, within a controlled framework. And the moment it exceeds that controlled framework, then it will become difficult for those people there as well. So one of the tragedies is that there isn't really a communication between Kashmiris on this side of the border or that side of the border. In fact, right now, there isn't even a communication between Kashmiris of the valley and the people of Kargil, for example, or the people of Doda and Kishtwar and Rajouri and outside of the valley, So I think that this entire region, militarization has so sort of frozen everything. And it's only the internet which had in some ways broken through. And unfortunately, at least for the last 3 months, we haven't even had access to those channels of communication.
And I think the logic of the nation state is always to divide and conquer in many ways amongst religious and ethnic and other communities. And that's why it's become so hard for there to be kind of the singular narrative of that entire region of Kashmir. But again, what I think is really important and what people are asking for is that the first step for any kind of resolution to take place is that that kind of communication, the militarization, obviously the region has to be demilitarized, but those open lines of communication, of being able to talk to the people on the other side, within both sides of Kashmir is really integral, because that is where those emancipatory political visions can take form.
I just want to quickly add to something I forgot earlier. You know, the part of Kashmir which is controlled by Pakistan, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, it has always been a sort of space where Kashmiris have used as a to launch their struggle within Kashmir, you know, from early 90s to the present. So it's not that the connections have not been there. There are so many families who've been displaced from Indian occupied side and have like truncated lives on the other side, have been unable to come back. There are like people who are married from one place to another. So those connections definitely do exist. What is necessary right now is that people in Azad Jammu and Kashmir also have to, they are already doing that outside of Pakistan, but within Pakistan also they have to create their own voice. Much of it is happening already, but it needs to be a more concrete and to align their own future, which is because the border that India and Pakistan have created within Kashmir is not permanent. It cannot be made permanent. It should not be made permanent and shouldn't be imagined as a permanent border. And so those connections need to be reactivated. The familiar kinship, cultural ties, linguistic ties that exist need to also be elevated to the level of political and imaginary.
Definitely. And we have a lot of people in the comments sort of resonating with this idea that you mentioned, Junaid, about unconditional solidarity, so that those strings attached, because it does almost seem like Pakistan and India are playing good cop, bad cop with Kashmir really well. And sort of the final question, which is also how we like to always end, is how can the international world support and heed these calls for international and global solidarity? And Hafsa, specifically, if you'd like to talk about what's happening tomorrow around the world, but how can everyday people in their sort of professions and their everyday lives be able to like center the struggle of Kashmir and sort of help push toward this movement for freedom?
So tomorrow, October 27th, to mark 72 years of the occupation, cities around the world are going to be hosting vigils or some kinds of events in their cities. So if you go to the Stand With Kashmir Facebook page and the website, then you should be able to see if there's anything in your city. So there's that. But I think kind of long term, excuse me, sorry. There's a lot of education, grassroots education that needs to take place. And I think that's really fundamental to really, as we've done here, to center Kashmiri voices, to learn about Kashmiri history, to learn about what Kashmiris are writing and saying. And you've already shared those resources with your listeners, and to educate yourselves in that sense. And we're hoping that wherever you are, you can bring people together to read, to watch films, to understand what's going on. And then only after that will you be able to kind of think through, how is your country implicated in Kashmir's occupation? What relationships, what ties does your country have to India? Where are those specific markers where that kind of link can be questioned, whether it's creating some kind of a boycott on particular Indian goods or products, where wherever you're based. I think there's so much scope for things to happen and for people to actually take part in this. I know sometimes when we think about change, we only think about change in terms of you have to write your letters to your MPs and your Congress people and your political elected officials, and that's fine. You should be doing that. We've been doing that in the diaspora as well. But I think that also needs to be complemented with like a grassroots movement that actually is what's pushing back on those institutions. This hearing did not happen because, you know, the United States or meetings at the UN didn't happen because these countries just felt, okay, we need to talk about this. It's because there was a lot of pressure from people and, you know, from Kashmiris themselves for that to happen. So, so yeah, and I think also it's really important to then connect the Kashmiri struggle with other movements that are happening in your country, whether it's the Palestine solidarity struggle, whether it's other struggles against militarism or war or settler colonialism. All of these kind of need to be seen in relation to each other so we can really have a shared language around these issues.
Shared language, absolutely. I think that's what we need to find, not one language, but shared, you know, that we understand the intersectional ways in which we kind of all inhabit our own vulnerabilities, our own precarities, and then see in the, when I, for instance, look at the struggle in Kashmir, I connect, and these treaties that India has abrogated. I look at the history of the Native Americans, for instance, in the US, and the way in which the US government from time to time abrogated their treaties. When I look at, for instance, the architecture of occupation that India has laid out in Kashmir, I look at Palestine and see how that you know, architecture has worked. I think people based in Palestine, Native American activists, as Kashmiris, we don't demand that they should learn everything about us, you know, because that's too much to ask from struggling peoples around the world. But what we ask is that to invoke us in their own articulations of freedom, you know, in their own theorizations of what is happening, that, you know, we cannot understand the world fully if we do not connect these different places and these struggles. And that's what would be a really resonant global justice movement that needs to, you know, kind of emerge from these fragmented spaces, these different political movements around the world.
I'll just add a line to this, that I think that for people all across the world, the first step would be to recognize that there is a struggle in Kashmir. And it's a struggle that it's not to be remembered only for the price that its people have paid, but also for the dignity and the intelligence with which people have been arguing their case. And I think an acknowledgement of struggle, an acknowledgement that this is a struggle and this is what it's about. And it's about something very simple. The word is azadi. It's about freedom. And we can break that word down into a million ways. But in essence, it's about the dignity that is attached to that word. And I think that once people recognize that, then everything else simply follows.
Well, thank you so much. That was a really beautiful way to end a really amazing, informative, and helpful conversation. I know I learned so much. There's a lot of appreciations in the audience as well. And thank you all so very much for your time and all of your insight and all the work that you do, and not only sort of bringing Kashmir to the forefront, but also being able to draw these ties for people to understand their own complicity, and being able to make these links, as you all mentioned so powerfully. So I appreciate all of this. And if for those of you who are listening, you can still grab a free PDF of this book on our websites and read with us and join us. We'll be reading this through November as well. And many of our chapters also have collaborated or are in collaboration with Stand With Kashmir chapters and to put on events and things like that in their city, really raise this sort of level of awareness. And of course, continue to please on social media, ask your questions, put insight as you read, sort of share what you're reading with your followers as well with the hashtags Because We've Read and Stand With Kashmir. And yeah, thank you all so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Hoda. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Stop streaming.